Welcome, Professor Dan Hassler-Forrest from the University of Utrecht, where he's a professor of media and culture studies. Welcome, Dan.
Hey, Professor, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. Let's talk about like comics and transmedia and all that stuff. But before we jump into the specifics of your work, how in the
Yeah.
heck did you get into this stuff, Dan?
How, the thing is, I did an MA degree in film studies and another one in English literature. And then when I completed those, I just sort of got sidetracked into like a real world type career, like doing editing and emerging internet stuff. And I did that for a bunch of years. And then I realized, like, none of that really ever interested me besides, being like a job. And I'd always wanted to get back into academia. So by that time, I was older than most people who are grad students. So I had younger people to compete with, and I had to find like a kind of a niche. And I figured the thing that nobody really seemed to be doing, but that seemed like a good hybrid of the two media that I was most interested in. So there was literature and film, and was comics. So comics had the visual elements from movie storytelling. They were on the page and printed, and here in the Netherlands where I am, there wasn't a huge amount of work being done in them. And so I figured, well, if I'm going to do a PhD or going to do any kind of research, maybe that's a field that I can, specialize in. So that was my original strategy. But none of that really, really panned out. I mean, when I was getting ready, I started teaching whatever kind of course they would give me in film studies or in English literature. I would just, as an adjunct, I would teach. I worked together with a great friend and colleague of mine who was a little more senior, Joyce Goggin, and she and I put together a book on comic studies that was real. That put me in touch with a lot of people, and I started going to conferences and giving papers on comics, but mostly on movies that were based on comics. So we talk about Batman Begins and V for Vendetta and that kind of stuff. And then my PhD really grew out of that interest. But the PhD, it's funny because the PhD was on superheroes, but it wasn't really on comics. It was on comic book movies. So the book, oh, there it is. So the Capitalist Superheroes book is what came out of my PhD. And it's really about the first wave of superhero movies in the 21st century and how they followed on after 9/11 and how a lot of 9/11 discourse got mixed up in them in a lot of ways. So after that, I've been mistaken constantly for a comic scholar, even though I'm only, I guess I'm comics proximate, but I haven't really I've done two books. There's the one book that is forthcoming, which is there on the right, the Handbook of Comics and Graphic Narratives. And I've done the book next to it, The Rise and Reason of Comics. And I did one that has superheroes in the title. So I guess, that makes me kind of a comics person. And I like to read comics a lot, but I guess, anyway, that's how I got into it. That's how I got into it.
Well, as you and I both know so well, and many of our sort of very kind of great colleagues like, Jared Gardner and others have talked about, comics and film and radio and TV and all that stuff, it's all kind of, they're all cousins, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, I could
Yeah, to
totally
me,
yeah.
it's all like I've always been I've just been a voracious consumer of American commercial pop culture. So, everything from music videos to TV jingles to, sitcoms and pop music and comic books and toys and, breakfast cereal, like all of that is sort of, it's one kind of American pop culture to me. And it always seems, I still find it a little bit bewildering that in my own department where I teach, students are offered introductory courses in film, in television, in new media, whatever that means, in 2020, and in theater, as if those were totally separate things. And to me, they're much more alike than I understand that they all, academically, we have all these little territories that we like to map out. But to me, it just feels like there's no way to really separate them. So a lot of the books and articles that I've done ended up having the word transmedia in the title, which I think, I mean, like, to me, that's just the thing that helps me make sense of the way that media and culture really work, as something that is constantly jostling up against each other and infiltrating each other and infecting each other with all kinds of interesting overlaps and hybridizations, but not really as separate, as separate media or separate fields.
Yeah, no, thank you. Wonderful. And of course, so here you are. I'm going to take this track because, well, I love it, but I also looks like some opportunities in this area. And then you've just been publishing like a mad person, right? There's a kind of nonstop, outpouring from you and all of the work you've been doing. Tell me, like, what is the kind of vision, the Dan vision and approach transmedia, to culture, to the way this stuff is both created, and at the same time itself interacts and transforms, right?
Yeah. Well, to me, it's like, I think if there's one thing that defines my interest in all of this stuff, because it's also like, whether it's Star Wars or Mouse or any, or a TV show or anything, it's just that kind of popular culture all feels like the place where a lot of our most interesting social debates are really being staged, and where the stakes are mapped out, where meanings are being contested and created and shifted around. And even though it always, in a way, it feels like you're working in this field of culture that seems trivial in a world where like serious shit is going on all the time. There are politics and economic crises and wars and stuff. At the same time, I really do feel that the way we make meaning about all of that stuff, the way we make sense of it, is in part, it's all projected onto these screens and pages and interfaces that tell us goofy stories about laser swords and droids and stuff. And when I watch my kids, I mean, today is May the 4th, so we did our whole Star Wars thing today, and I watched The Last Jedi for the first time with my kids, and just the variety of stuff that they not just the meaning that they derive from the film, but the way that they just instantly transcribe it onto their own identities, and how that can shift even throughout one film. Like my 5-year-old, he'll go, like, one scene he'll be like, I'm Luke, right? Because he recognizes something about Luke's behavior that he looks up to. And the next scene, no, I'm the Porgs, because the collective of the Porgs and their silliness and their good-naturedness is something that he then suddenly relates to. And you can literally see these kids just picking up, they're these bricoleurs, just to use a pedantic academic term, but just sort of putting together these identities using this stuff from this crappy science fiction, like I love The Last Jedi, but it's like crappy popular culture science fiction movie. So that's, I think, I mean, that's literally where, if that's the place where our identities are made, it's also the place that seems to me like ultimately really worth investing a lot of time in.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, definitely. So politics of adaptation, in a way, you kind of got at that just now, but can you, I don't know, elaborate a little bit for us?
Yeah, it's like this book is a fun memory, because it's a book that we really put together out of spite, which I don't know if that's the best reason to publish an academic collection, but why not? Because I started out in these two different fields, obviously adaptation seemed like the place to be, right? If you come from literature and film, because adaptation studies, as a sort of semi-academic or academic semi-discipline, I should say, has been the study of how books get made into movies. And I'd go to these adaptation studies conferences, but I just found that so much of the energy there was going into describing how one text gets transcribed into a different one, and how some things are the same, but some things also get changed, but without really going beyond that. And over drinks, at the conference, at the dinner, I had too much wine and was talking with friends. Like, we shouldn't be talking about texts, and we shouldn't be talking about what happens to a book when it gets changed. We should just be talking about how all of this is constantly just creating political identities and reproducing or challenging political positions. And we should call it the politics of adaptation. We should have a conference. And the guy sitting next to me was like, you're totally right. And I have the money to do it, and we'll do it in Germany, and let's make it happen. And like next year, then that happened, and the book came out of it. And all of the articles in the book ended up being really, I found really interesting interventions, I guess, in the field of adaptation studies, which since then has proliferated in a lot of more interesting ways, I think, than it was back, was like 6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah.
But so that's, yeah. So I think like maybe to provide a little bit more of a grounding for what I was saying before about how everything feels connected through politics in the end. I mean, I don't really think that I'm ultimately a literary studies person or a film studies person. I'm, somebody who's really into political and critical theory, but who happens also to love literature and popular media. So everything that I look at, I end up looking at through that lens of politics and ideology and meaning making.
Yeah, that's really great. There is something kind of, I'm in the same kind of boat as you, where, you hear or you read something about adaptation, Shakespeare or Jane Austen, and you're right, it somehow still seeks to elevate, I don't know, the literary artifact, right?
Yeah.
Somehow. And what I love about your work is that you're really kind of teasing out the kind of these nodes of convergence, right? And not really that interested in kind of the, say, fidelity model, right? Yeah.
No, or even, I mean, even in describing, I mean, I know that it's important to describe and devote a lot of attention to how texts work and what they do. But I like most of the books that I really love to read, they really cut to the chase. I mean, these Italian post-autonomous, crazy theorists like, Bifo Berardi or Hart and Negri or those kinds of guys, they just say the most outrageous stuff, like the most hyperbolic sounding political statement, and they feel very true to me. And they just say, I think for most people, the core figure for that way of doing cultural criticism would be Slavoj Žižek, and just, being saying totally outrageous, over the top things, and sometimes getting it right and really nailing a point about something. And because I'm surrounded by a lot of people who are much more grounded in more traditional film studies and who use actual methods to do their analysis, and who are a little bit more careful about, making irresponsible, grandiose sounding, sweeping generalizations about everything all the time. I always feel like I'm sort of trying to navigate between those two things, right? Trying to be somebody who could still stay in dialogue with I guess more traditional humanities, literary theorists and film scholars, but who's got certainly one leg in the the crazy Žižekian ideology and critical theory world. And I don't know if those two are really compatible, but it's just a fun kind of thing to do.
Well, it is. It definitely gets us thinking in ways that are new and important. So you also like sci-fi. I mean, this sci-fi, fantasy, politics. Tell us about how this connects with your other work.
Well, I guess I just discovered a couple, like it sounds silly, but maybe 4 or 5 years ago, maybe a little longer, I don't quite remember, but I discovered that there was such a thing as science fiction studies, which never even had occurred to me that would, of course, everything has its own academic field one way or the other. There's a theme park studies, there's all kinds of stuff. But I just never realized that there was a science. I would have called myself a science fiction scholar way sooner if I'd known that had been a thing you could do. I just figured, I worked in it I started off teaching in a media studies department. Then I moved to an English literature department. And in both of those, I was always the one doing, sort of flaky, popular, science fiction-y, comic booky type things, things that are sort of on the margins of respectable humanities research. So where students in other classes would be reading more traditional literature with me, we'd be reading, Crazy Cat and Watchmen and stuff like that. Or if I was doing a media studies course, then we would be reading Marx alongside, Breaking Bad or something, to try to get some kind of weird interaction going. And so I guess my friend Jerry Canavan, he got me involved with the Science Fiction Research Association, and he just got me excited to come. He said, you should come to one of these conferences. There's two big annual science fiction conferences. There's ICFA, which is the International Conference for the Fantastic in the Arts. And then there's the Science Fiction Research Association. And I went to a couple of those, and then they got me involved as one of the editors of the journal Science Fiction, Film, and Television. And then I just felt, with the science fiction people at these conferences, I just felt for the first time really strongly that I was with people who thought and wrote about things the way that I do. So like they tend to like theorize things very strongly and from a very political lens. They like the way that science fiction provides kind of a method for doing critical theory, for creating sort of an alienation from the object that you're looking at, and and doing this from a very like radical left-wing progressive a political perspective. So I've sort of gravitated towards that and allowed myself to be, I figured, if I did my PhD on superhero movies, and I did books on comic books and on transmedia storytelling and on Star Wars, I mean, the thing that sort of connects all of that is, well, not to put too fine a line on it, but, fantastic literature, so science fiction or fantastic fiction. So science fiction and fantasy, which to me is, is a kind of an arbitrary distinction, but I understand why people still make it. But the fantastic, I guess, is, and to me, the fantastic is in a way the most political genre, because it's always about, it's not about reproducing the world that we know, but it's about presenting us with worlds that feel in one way or the other strange or unfamiliar to us. And therefore, if we let them, they help us, challenge our ideas of what is real or what could be real or what we want. I guess that's the well, it's not a short answer, but that's the answer.
Yeah, I love that, as a sort of space of the speculative, but also grounded, ultimately, and transformative and intellectual and creative.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love it.
And goofy. I mean, don't forget, it's like, it's also just, goofy. And I think the way that, if you, once you bring lightsabers into a conversation, or you start talking about a warp drive, or, beaming people out of the way, it just lightens the mood. It's all of a sudden, you're not talking about, the proletariat or the means of production or all these other, sort of heavy sounding political economic terms, but you're talking about them, but you're approaching them from, the Starship Enterprise, which all of a sudden makes it feel like fun. I guess that's a big part of it for me.
Absolutely. So Dan, what is your, is there a Dan Hassler Forrest kind of trademark of, bringing transmedia into the classroom? I mean, you've already given us a bunch of examples of, how you kind of combine and create sort of creative and intellectual kind of convergence moments. But yeah, what would, if you were taking a step back, what's your trademark?
I guess the one thing is enthusiasm. So I've, when I was a student in most of the classrooms, I was just bored out of my mind, because it just, I think, and I would blame the professors, but I'm less inclined to do that today, because by now I just know that, if you're an academic, there's really no reward for investing a lot of time or energy. Most people who end up being scholars, they're not trained to be teachers. They really don't have any affinity for it. It's kind of the thing that you have to, for some people, that you have to do, that you're expected to do and required to do alongside your real academic work. And for me, the thing that drew me to academia was actually teaching, was thinking and talking about the stuff that I love with young people. And that's still the thing that I love most about it. And I mean, the first time I was just put into a classroom with students with no preparation or instruction on what to do, I was just sort of panicking and thinking, my God, of all the professors that I knew and when I was a student, I mean, what did they do? What did they even do? But what did they do? What did the couple of ones that I liked do right? And I just realized, the ones that I really liked, they just came in, with guns blazing. You know, they were just, they were up at 11 all the time, because you know that if the professor is up at 11, they might bring the students up to maybe a 4 or a 5. But if you're at a 6 yourself, if you're just sort of, you know, then you're never going to bring any real life into the classroom, because the students are just coming in prepared to be bored. I mean, that's the way I would come in, and students are no different today. So, I mean, the bar isn't terrifically high. It's not like you're performing in a stand-up, you know, where people are gonna boo you or anything like that. Students are expecting to be bored. So if you come in and you just try not to be boring, and you bring in real passion and enthusiasm for the thing that you're talking about, whatever that is, you just find an angle to make it exciting to you, then that's the thing. That, to me, that's the thing. And I think and I think it works for a lot of people. For some people, one student really hurt I felt very weird when I saw a student in evaluation last year, right, that I could be a little bit overwhelming. And then I thought, oh shit, that's, of course that makes sense, right? Intimidating. It was worse. Intimidating was the word that they used. And I thought, shit, am I the big loud guy? And I thought, yeah, okay. Clearly for some people, I'm going to be the big loud annoying guy who is, anyway, so that's who I am or have become. But that's the thing, I think, for me. Yeah.
Yeah. So a real kind of persona, that brings your personality and your intelligence to the floor and kind of draws them. And I can definitely see that, Dan. So where is the vitality in comics? Or maybe I should extend this farther. Where's the vitality in transmedia studies and comics and film? What's exciting to you today?
I think it's, I was thinking about this question when I was looking at the slides before. I'm thinking about how, both, in a way, comic studies is in a similar position, I think, where science fiction studies is. It's that for pop culture, everything now, every key thing is sort of derived from either the content, the IP, like the literal IP, or just the serialization logic that was developed in the comic book industry. So it's Storyworlds that grow and expand and are published serially, and so now either they're movies or they're transmedia universes with television offshoots and video games and all that stuff. But all that was developed in comics. I think by the same token, I mean that none of that stuff being put out there, whether we're talking about Marvel movies or Harry Potter universe stuff or The Walking Dead, or the big popular phenomena, none of that is really terrifically interesting. I mean, as texts, I mean they're very they're big and noisy and superficial, like myself, but they're not the interesting work being done. I mean, the interesting work being done in comics is being done in independent comics, and is being done in comics in any way in a medium that not many people read. I mean, none of my students are ever comics. Maybe there might be one lost soul who's a comic book reader in a seminar of mine, but it's a very niche medium. And the same thing goes for science fiction literature. I mean, everybody knows what science fiction is or has a kind of idea of it, and it's all over our popular spectrum. But very few of them have actually interesting science fictional political ideas. They're all very generic and very blah. In science fiction literature, there's a huge amount of magnificent stuff being done by Black women writers, by Latinx writers, by lots of minority groups, by Chinese science fiction is a hugely flourishing field, but hardly anybody reads it, So one of the things that I've been trying to do is to start from the popular and try to tempt people to make it a gateway drug, the way it could be, to start by reading something or by watching a movie. It's just start, fine. If you have, some people, they don't even think about, they know that Marvel movies exist, but they wouldn't even think about watching them, students of mine, and you get them into that. And then you go, well, actually, there's more interesting stuff as well. And the same thing goes for science fiction. You got to start off with something that seems like it's right there and it's accessible, and then some of them will move on into more interesting terrain. But I think the first step is sort of showing that even the most superficial, kind of seemingly frivolous popular stuff is more complicated than it seems, you know, and it is more political than it seems. It's more a part of our political and social life than it seems. It's just a part of our, you know, our cultural DNA. And looking at that beyond something that's just a commodity, you know, that's just a piece of entertainment that you watch for an evening, but is something that, you know, creates conflicting meanings or something like that, is already makes it more interesting to them. So I spend a lot of time with my students talking about Disney movies, for instance, because they know them at least, and they've just never thought about them as anything other than, you know, a virtual babysitter in a way. So even the idea that there's something more to it than just a story about, you know, lion cubs or princesses, and that it has anything to do with sexual identity or ethnicity or gender or fascism, you know, those are all ideas that they've never really thought about, and many of them find that very exciting, you know. And then all of a sudden, and then for some of them, you have the opportunity to push beyond that. But I think for comics, you know, there's always a couple of people that you find that are you know, that are that are nerds like me, that have whole shelves full of comic books, and they love that stuff, and they've found like a soulmate to talk about. But they're the exception. Most people, they just don't know comics, and some of them will be interested in engaging with it. Is that your experience as well with students, or do you have more?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Definitely. You know, the amount of, so 90% for sure have seen, you know, like a Marvel or
Yeah,
DC movie, right?
right.
99% say have seen, you know, a Star Wars. But when you actually push them a little bit and ask them if they've, you know, read a Star Wars comic book or
Yeah,
of fan fiction or fiction or, you know,
yeah,
any of those, and of course, you know, it starts to, you know, our numbers start to drop considerably.
yeah,
But yeah, I'm with you. I'm totally with you, and I think you're right. Like, let's see how we can kind of take them to these. I'm like you, these kind of convergent spaces where they're able to explore and to see new ways of kind of, you know, how the world operates. I think that's the real excitement.
yeah.
And maybe instead it should be, where is the vitality in kind of convergent spaces, transmedial spaces, right? Because that seems to be where you and I and others tend to kind of go, you know, with our students, maybe even with our work.
Yeah, I'm always reminded of that Raymond Williams line. What is it that, like, culture is, you know, one of the most complicated concepts that we have. And the funny thing is that the more, you know, our culture becomes, you know, the property of these transnational entertainment conglomerates, and the more it's all owned by Disney and Sony and Netflix and all these big companies, the more in a way it feels like a kind of generic consumer product and a commodity. Um, but if you look at what's actually going on inside them, there's still so much that's interesting and that's complex and that's, you know, challenging. It's just about learning to ask the right questions, right? I guess, about them, and getting the students into a dialogue. Yeah.
Absolutely. I know, I'll just give a quick example. Like, I don't know if I would be able to take students to a place of really interrogating US exceptionalism. And I'm just being honest here.
Mm, yeah.
If it were something that I like walked in and had a document and we just read that, but I can do it with Justice League.
Yeah. Yeah.
I show that movie and we kind of unpack it, and by the end they get it and
Yeah.
they understand what this is all about, and they start to self-reflect in really critical ways.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, gosh, so I want to say, well, thank you, Dan, for taking the time for this. And well, I think we should X out comics in and of itself and just put kind of transmedia or maybe convergence culture spaces, and they matter. Thank you, Dan.
Wow, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.